In 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, Louisiana was filled with tensions that went much deeper than just politics. In the Mississippi Delta, where hot steam from the river carried the sweet smell of cotton along with the sharp odor of human sweat, small plantations fought hard to stay alive amid the South's economic troubles. Just a few miles outside New Orleans, where slave auctions happened every day in open squares, Delaney Plantation covered a modest 200 acres of rich, fertile land. Unlike the huge grand estates that ruled the area, this place belonged to a family struggling to hold on to their position in Southern life. Clement Delaney was no wealthy cotton king. He was a man with little money, owning just 15 slaves and a 2-story wooden house that was already starting to fall apart. But what took place inside those walls between 1860 and 1863 would show a side of slavery that almost no one wanted to think about. This is one of the most upsetting stories I've ever come across about the hidden terrors of the antebellum South, a tale that proves how desperation can turn an ordinary family man into something far more evil than a monster. Before we go further, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this is your first visit to Legacy of Fear, please subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you up at night. Delaney Plantation had seen better times. Clement Delaney, at 45, was a man of average height with brown hair turning grey and hands rough from hard work. Unlike the big landowners, who almost never worked the fields themselves, Clement labored right alongside his slaves in the cotton rows, a fact he tried to pretend was his own choice. His wife Joanna, 38 years old, looked much older than her age. Her once bright blonde hair now hung dull around a face full of constant worry. She had given birth to 4 children, but only 3 lived: Arlene, 19, Carolyn, 17, and Freda, the youngest, at just 15. The 3 Delaney girls were seen as very beautiful by the standards of that time. Arlene had her mother's golden hair and sharp blue eyes. Carolyn had softer features, brown hair, and a delicate body. Freda, the youngest, mixed her sister's beauty with a lively spirit that had not yet been fully crushed by the hard realities of life. The plantation ran with 15 slaves, 8 men and 7 women. Among them was Tobias, a strong man around 30 who acted as an unofficial overseer, and Leah, a 25-year-old woman who worked inside the big house. Most had been born right there on the property, creating complicated family ties that Clement would soon begin to take advantage of in terrible ways. Money problems started in 1858 when disease ruined much of the cotton crop. The harvest gave less than half the normal amount, so Clement had to borrow money at very high interest from merchants in New Orleans. To make things worse, he developed a serious gambling habit that ate up any extra cash. The nights when Clement went missing to play cards became more common. He would come home in the early morning, usually with less money than he left with, his face showing anger and too much drink. During those times away, Joanna often found him alone in his office, muttering to himself while doing endless calculations on pieces of paper he quickly hid when she came near. In 1859, things got impossible to handle. Creditors started showing up at the plantation, well-dressed men from New Orleans who talked in legal language about taking the property and selling it to pay debts. Clement was forced to sell 3 of his best slaves, a choice that deeply shamed him in front of the local people. The sale gave short-term help, but it also showed something troubling in Clement's actions. While making the deals, he showed a cold, businesslike attitude that surprised even the most experienced buyers. He checked the slaves' teeth, muscles, and old scars like they were animals, openly talking about their ability to have children and their worth on the market. Dr. Reuben McCormick, the local doctor who sometimes came to the plantation, noticed big changes in Clement's behavior during this time. The man who used to be quiet but friendly became more withdrawn and fixated on strange ideas. McCormick saw that Clement started asking odd questions about fertility, pregnancy, and the legal rules about children born to slaves. Clement's talks with other slave owners also changed. He showed too much interest in the darker parts of the slave trade, asking about breeding farms and ways to get the most babies from female slaves. These remarks made even men used to slavery's cruelty feel uneasy. Sheriff Peter Mullins, who had known Clement for a long time, noticed that the man started avoiding eye contact during his rare visits to the place. Mullins thought it was just shame over money troubles, but there was something deeper, a secretive way that hinted at thoughts too dark to share. During the winter of 1859, Clement spent many hours shut in his office, reading legal papers and slave laws. Joanna sometimes found him bent over borrowed law books, writing notes on papers he hid fast when she walked in. He had gotten several books about property rules and inheritance, things that seemed strange for a simple cotton farmer. His mood inside the big house started to shift in small but noticeable ways. The daughters felt their father watching them differently, with a judging look that made them uneasy. Arlene told her mother she felt like she was being studied, though she couldn't quite say why. Leah also noticed changes in how Clement acted toward her. He began asking personal questions about her health, age, and past pregnancies, questions that felt wrong even for a slave owner. She saw he paid extra attention to the younger slave women, watching them work with a strange intensity that scared her. Family meals turned tense. Clement often seemed lost in his own thoughts, answering questions with short grunts or empty replies. Joanna tried to keep things normal, but she felt growing worry she couldn't fully explain. She started noticing Clement taking notes during meals, watching his daughter's eating and health in a way that felt more like a doctor than a father. In January 1860, Clement took a strange 3-day trip to New Orleans. When he came back, he carried a leather case full of papers he locked away carefully in his office. He had also made contact with a man called Bogard, someone he described only as helpful with difficult legal issues. The spring of 1860 gave a good cotton harvest, but it also started bigger changes in Clement's actions. He began rearranging the slave quarters, keeping men and women more strictly apart, and adding new rules that seemed to have no real reason. The Delaney daughters noticed their father limiting their time outside the home, stopping visits to neighbors, and turning away guests. He said it was for safety because of rising political problems, but his reasons sounded weak and forced. Dr. McCormick made his last friendly visit to the plantation in April 1860. He later described the place as strangely heavy and tense, saying the family seemed under stress bigger than just money were rise. During that visit, McCormick heard Clement make upsetting remarks about how some plantations made the most use of their human workers. The doctor felt especially uncomfortable when Clement asked about ways to check young women's fertility and the dangers of many pregnancies. Sheriff Mullins made his final official stop at the plantation in May 1860, checking reports of runaway slaves nearby. He noticed the slaves at Delaney seemed more quiet and afraid than usual, avoiding eye contact and answering questions with short, nervous words. Mullins also saw new strong locks and bolts on several doors of the big house, locks that seemed meant to keep people inside rather than keep others out. His summer of 1860 became the point where Clement could not turn back. Money pressure mixed with his growing fixation on extreme solutions led him to make a choice that turned his family into victims of his own greed and twisted mind. In June 1860, Clement became a man eaten up by one dark idea that grew inside him like a sickness. Through his endless reading of slavery laws, he found an old legal rule from the early days of American colonies called partus sequitur ventrum. This law said, a child's status followed the mother's. If the mother was a slave, the child was born a slave no matter who the father was. The twisted cleverness of Clement's plan came from his knowledge of a legal weakness. Children born to his own free daughters would normally be free by law, but with fake papers, those babies could be listed as born to slave mothers, making them legal property ready to sell. It was a horrible twisting of the law that would turn his own grandchildren into items for sale. During his visits to New Orleans, Clement had connected with Bogard, a forger who worked in the dark corners of the French Quarter. This man, whose real name stayed hidden, was expert at making fake birth papers, baptism records, and ownership documents that could pass normal checks. Bogard worked from a small room above a bar and also made fake freedom papers and travel documents for runaways, a risky but very profitable trade. For $50 per paper, a large amount back then, he could create birth records that named any child born on the plantation as belonging to a slave mother, allowing legal sale. Clement started putting his plan into action with the careful planning of someone growing a business. He completely changed the slave quarters, building what he called special rooms, small separate cabins where breeding would happen under his close watch. The first step involved picking strong male slaves to use as breeders. Clement chose Tobias and two other young, healthy men, deciding based on their physical condition, calm nature, and disturbingly on traits he thought would make their children more valuable on the market. Female slaves faced the same humiliating checks. Clement examined Leia and others himself, looking at their reproductive health with cold, clinical distance that left D.P. wounds. He wrote detailed notes about their monthly cycles, past pregnancies, and expected ability to produce strong children. But the most horrifying part of Clement's plan involved his own daughters. Arlene, Carolyn, and Freda would be forced to take part in the breeding program, making children who would then be taken away and recorded as slave babies. The first child arrived in June 1861, Arlene's son. The birth was hard and painful, done by Clement with little help from Leia. Arlene had serious problems that almost killed her, but Clement cared more about the baby's health than the mother's. Right after the birth, Clement took the baby away from Arlene and brought him to the slave quarters, where a slave who had just lost her own child would raise him. Arlene was told she would never see the child again and that trying to make contact would bring harsh punishment. The fake papers for the baby came from New Orleans a week later. The birth record named Leia as the mother, making the child legally sellable as a slave. Clement felt pleased with how good the fake documents looked, believing they would pass any normal check. 3 weeks after the birth, Clement sold the baby to a slave trader in New Orleans for $250. The deal went through middlemen, keeping no link to Delaney Plantation. Clement used the money to pay some of his worst debts. Seeing this as proof his plan worked, the first sale pushed him to speed up the next pregnancies. Still, he decided to wait at least 6 months before forcing Arlene into new sessions, knowing she needed time to heal from the hard birth. The second baby came in August 1861, Carolyn's son. The birth was even worse than the first, with Carolyn bleeding so much she passed out for 2 days. Clement, worried only about the baby's survival, got annoyed at his daughter's medical problems, seeing them as annoying delays to his work. Carolyn never really got better from the physical and emotional pain of giving birth. She developed what we would now call severe postpartum depression, but Clement just saw it as womanly weakness. When she refused food or self-care, he forced her to drink herb mixtures he said would help her recover, but which actually controlled her cycles for future pregnancies. Carolyn's baby sold in September 1861 for $275. A bit more because of his especially light appearance. Clement felt happy with the growing money and started planning to make the operation bigger, thinking about buying more female slaves just for breeding. Freda gave birth in October 1861, but her delivery was difficult because of her young age and weak body. The child came early and was small, needing extra care that Clement saw as an investment for later profit. Freda suffered lasting physical harm during birth, including inner injuries that would stop her from having more children later. Dr. McCormick called because of problems, worried about Freda's condition, but another big payment from Clement kept him quiet. Brr. Oana, watching the nightmare happen in her own home, started showing signs of mental breakdown. She had tried many times to speak up for her daughters, but Clement's threats of violence kept her silent. She began drinking in secret, using alcohol to dull the pain of seeing her daughters slowly destroyed. At night she often walked the house like a shadow, whispering prayers and begging God to forgive her for not protecting her children. The mental health of every woman on the plantation got much worse under Clement's cruel system. Arlene fell into a catatonic state, sometimes sitting still for hours staring at nothing. Carolyn had endless nightmares and panic attacks that made normal life impossible. Freda, the youngest, showed the worst signs of mental damage. She started seeing things that weren't there, often talking to her missing baby as if he was still with her. Clement saw these problems only as things that got in the way of more breeding, not as signs of real human pain that needed kindness. In December 1861, after giving his daughters a few months to recover, Clement forced Arlene back into breeding sessions. She became pregnant again in January 1862, but her second pregnancy brought even worse problems that put both her life and the baby's at risk. Carolyn also got pregnant again in March 1862, but her damaged body made the pregnancy very dangerous. Dr. McCormick, called to check her, said he worried the women might not live through more births. Clement ignored Babar. these warnings as too careful, giving the doctor extra money to stay quiet. Freda, still healing from her first awful birth, was forced into the breeding again in April 1862. Her second pregnancy was harder than the first, with problems starting early. Clement got annoyed with the difficulties, seeing them as blocks to his plan's success. The mood at Delaney Plantation turned darker as winter 1862 came. The women lived in constant fear, never knowing when they would be forced into new sessions or when their babies would be taken away. Clement became more and more obsessed and suspicious. He saw plots in every question and answered any challenge with growing violence. His change from family man to monster was finished, and he seemed unable to see the humanity in his own daughters anymore. The slaves on the plantation also suffered under Clement's harsh rule. Tobias and the other men forced to take part showed signs of deep mental pain, knowing they had been unwilling helpers in destroying their owners' daughters. In September 1862, Arlene gave birth to her second child, but the baby was born dead because of problems from her hard pregnancy. Clement got angry about losing the investment and blamed Arlene for not taking good care of herself. The baby's death hit Arlene hard. She had secretly hoped she might keep this one. Carolyn gave birth in October 1862, but suffered terrible complications that almost killed her. Dr. McCormick worked hard to save her life, but it became clear she could not survive another pregnancy. Clement, upset about lower production, started thinking of Carolyn as less useful. Freda gave birth in November 1862, but the delivery was so bad she almost died. The baby lived, but Freda was badly damaged. Unable to walk without help and in constant pain, Clement sold the baby right away, showing no care for his youngest daughter's dangerous state. In January 1863, the tragedy that had been building for years finally reached its breaking point. Freda, unable to take any more pain, and facing the thought of being forced to get pregnant again despite her broken body, made a desperate choice that would shock even Clement and force Joanna to face what her husband had truly become. The discovery of Freda's body on a cold January morning would start the end of Clement Delaney's time of terror, but it would also show how deeply evil had taken root in the soul of a man once seen as a normal member of Southern society. On the morning of January 15, 1863, Leah found Freda's body hanging from a rope made of torn bedsheets in the big house attic. The young woman, only 17, had chosen death as her only way out of the nightmare her life had become. Clement heard about Freda's death with a coldness that shocked even Joanna. His first thought wasn't the loss of his youngest daughter, but how her death would hurt his breeding operation. He quickly figured he had lost a valuable worker and started thinking of ways to make up for it. Joanna, however, was destroyed by Freda's death. Seeing her youngest daughter's body hanging broke something deep inside her mind. She understood she had completely failed to protect her daughters and that her silence had helped the tragedy happen in her own home. That night, she stayed on her knees beside Freda's body for hours, whispering sorry and promising some kind of revenge. Freda's funeral was quiet and rushed. Clement demanded a simple burial in the plantation graveyard, saying he didn't want to draw extra attention to the family. Really, he worried a public funeral might cause questions about how Freda died. Dr. McCormick was called to look at the body and write a death certificate. He saw marks of physical harm on Freda that didn't match a simple suicide, but Clement said they came from accidents while working on the plantation. McCormick felt doubtful, but the money Clement had paid him over time created a silent agreement that stopped him from asking harder questions. Sheriff Mullins also looked into Freda's death, but his check was quick and shallow. Society back then rarely looked deeply into deaths that happened inside private homes, especially family ones. Mullins accepted Clement's story of womanly sadness as the reason for suicide. Ida's death became a turning point for Joanna. She started secretly watching her husband's actions, mentally noting every horror he did to her remaining daughters. She knew she had to do something, but also knew facing Clement directly would be useless and dangerous. Joanna began making quiet contact with some of the plantation's most trusted slaves, especially those forced into Clement's breeding plan. She learned they were also deeply hurt by what they had been made to do and wanted a way to fight back. Tobias in particular felt great pain from his forced part in hurting the Delaney daughters. He had grown a protective feeling toward the women and was ready to risk his life to help them. Joanna saw he could be a strong ally in any plan to stop Clement. During quiet talks in the slave quarters, Tobias told Joanna that other slaves were ready to act too, joined together by the shared horror of what they had been forced to see and do. In February 1863, Arlene was forced back into breeding sessions even though she was still hurting emotionally from losing her second baby. Clement showed no care for her sadness, thinking only of keeping his operation going. Arlene became pregnant again, but her third pregnancy had even worse problems that threatened her life and the baby's. Caroline, too damaged physically to handle another pregnancy because of harm from earlier births, was spared from breeding, but Clement made her watch over the other pregnant women. This job hurt her even more, forcing her to help in the abuse of her own sister. Joanna, seeing her daughters being destroyed piece by piece, started making a desperate plan. She knew the law would give no protection from the horrors Clement was doing, and she would need to take extreme steps to save her living daughters. In April 1863, Joanna began secret meetings with Tobias and other trusted slaves when Clement was away. They talked in low voices about the chance of taking direct action against the plantation owner. Tobias said there were more slaves willing to join, men who had been forced to do things against their conscience and who wanted a chance to make things right. Clement started noticing small changes in the plantation's feeling. In May 1863, the slaves seemed more together, talking quietly among themselves and stopping when he came close. His growing fear made him add stricter rules, but this only made the tension and anger stronger. As Arlene's third pregnancy moved forward, it became clear she would not live through another birth. Dr. McCormick called to check her, said he had serious worry about her condition. Clement ignored these warnings, caring only about the possible value of the baby she carried. In June 1863, Joanna made a choice that would change everything. During one of Clement's late-night gambling trips, she met with Tobias and 3 other slaves in the slave quarters. They agreed the only way to end the horror was to remove Clement forever. The plan they made was simple but careful. Clement always came back from gambling late at night, often drunk and not paying attention. They would wait for him on the path back to the plantation, attacking when he was most open. The right moment came. On a stormy night in July 1863, Clement had gone to a local tavern to play cards, something he still did even as the Civil War made the area more dangerous. Joanna knew he would return late, likely drunk and careless. Joanna and Tobias waited on the path back to the plantation, hidden among the trees. 2 other slaves stood farther ahead on the trail, making sure Clement couldn't run if he tried. When Clement appeared, swaying on his horse from drink, they attacked quickly and with planning. Clement's death was fast but not gentle. Tobias pulled him off the horse while Joanna held the animal. They then set the scene to look like a robbery, throwing Clement's things around and hurting the horse to make it seem like bandits had attacked a lone traveler. The growing lawlessness in the area during the Civil War made this story completely believable. Clement's body was found the next morning by a neighbor passing by. Sheriff Mullins checked the scene and decided Clement had been killed by robbers, an answer he accepted easily because of more violent crime in the region during the war. Joanna played the part of sad widow perfectly, showing the right amount of shock and sorrow at her husband's death. No one thought she had any part in the killing, and people saw her as another victim of the hard times. During the funeral, she cried real tears, not from sadness over Clement, but from relief that her daughters were finally safe. With Clement gone, the time of terror at Delaney Plantation ended. Joanna quickly freed all the slaves and started selling the property, using the money to care for her deeply hurt daughters and try to rebuild their lives. Arlene gave birth to her 3rd child in August 1863, but the delivery almost killed her. With Clement dead, Joanna could finally let Arlene keep the baby, a moment of painful happiness after years of horror. Still, the physical and mental damage Arlene suffered could never fully heal. Caroline never really recovered from the traumas she went through, developing a nervous problem that left her unable to live normally for the rest of her life. She spent whole days in silence, sometimes having moments where she relived the horrors. Arlene, though she lived, carried deep emotional wounds that never went away. She developed a strong fear of touch and could never have normal relationships with men. The baby she was allowed to keep became her only source of light in a life full of pain. Joanna spent the rest of her life taking care of her damaged daughters, always carrying guilt for not acting sooner to save them. She often asked herself if she could have saved Freda if she had found the courage earlier, a question that hurt her until she died. The truth about what happened at Delaney Plantation died with Clement and stayed buried with the secrets of those who lived through it. Tobias left after freedom, probably going north to live as a free man. Before leaving, he visited Joanna one last time, thanking her for finding the strength to act when the law failed. Leah also left after freedom, carrying the painful memories of her forced part in Clement's plan. She settled in New Orleans, working as a seamstress, and never talked about her years at Delaney Plantation. Until she died many years later, she carried the physical and emotional scars of her time there. Dr. McCormick kept practicing medicine in the area, but never again took questionable money for staying quiet. Freda's death and the later knowledge of the horrors at the plantation haunted him for the rest of his work, reminding him of what happened when he stayed silent. Sheriff Mullins never learned the truth about Clement's death until he himself passed away years later. His quick investigation and easy acceptance of the robbery story showed the limits and biases of a legal system that protected men like Clement while failing their victims. His story of Delaney Plantation stands as a dark warning of how desperation and greed can completely destroy a person's soul. Clement Delaney turned his own family into goods for sale, proving that the evils of slavery could reach far beyond normal racial lines. What makes this story so upsetting is not just the single acts of cruelty, but the organized way Clement took away humanity. He didn't act from sudden anger or desire, but with the cold planning of a businessman trying to make his business better. His own daughters became items in a mental list of profits and losses. Society in 1860, with its laws that gave fathers total power, created the perfect place for such horrors to grow in secret. The rules about slavery, meant to control enslaved African people, were twisted by Clement to enslave his own bloodline. Dr. McCormick and Sheriff Mullins, as parts of the normal social system, failed completely to see or stop the horrors happening right in front of them. Their shallow checks and acceptance of easy answers show how society back then was built to protect men like Clement, not the people they hurt. Joanna's final stand shows both saving and tragedy. Her choice to plan her husband's death came too late to save Freda or stop years of pain for her other daughters. Yet her action proves that even in the worst situations, human conscience can finally fight against pure evil. Obius and the other slaves who helped get revenge on Clement show how oppression can create unlikely friendships. Joined by shared suffering, they went beyond the racial walls society built to find justice when the law would not help. The lives of Clement's surviving daughters show how deep trauma can leave marks that no amount of later care can fully remove. Arlene and Carolyn carried the physical and mental wounds of their suffering for the rest of their lives, living reminders of the horrors they went through. The ease with which Clement faked papers and sold babies shows the basically rotten nature of the slavery system. A market that treated people as property naturally created chances for even worse abuses, where even the closest family ties could be turned into money. Perhaps the most shocking part of this story is how Clement could explain his actions to himself. In his broken mind, he wasn't hurting his daughters. He was saving the family through hard but needed sacrifices. This ability to justify himself shows how ordinary people can turn into monsters when conditions and rewards line up in terrible ways. Delaney Plantation was sold and broken into smaller pieces. The big house was torn down in the 1870s, and today nothing marks the spot where so much cruelty happened. The land that once saw such evil now grows peaceful crops, as if nature itself wants to wipe away the memory of what took place there. Official records from the time list Clement Delaney as simply killed by robbers and Freda as a victim of sadness. These clean descriptions hide the brutal reality of their deaths and keep the suffering of victims of family abuse and sexual harm invisible. This story makes us face an uncomfortable truth. Monsters are rarely strangers hiding in dark places. More often, they are fathers, husbands, and people in charge who use their trusted positions to do the worst kinds of harm. Respectable appearance can hide the deepest evil perfectly. Joanna's final bravery, even though came too late to stop all the tragedy, teaches us about the need to act against wrong, even when the personal cost is huge. Her choice to plan Clement's death was morally hard, an act of personal justice born from the total failure of the legal system to protect the helpless. Today, when we hear about cases of family abuse or sexual harm, we must remember that victims often face the same problems the Delaney daughters did: authorities who don't believe them, legal systems that protect the wrongdoers, and societies that prefer to look away from hard truths. The story of Delaney Plantation remains a dark record of humanity's ability for both complete evil and brave resistance. It reminds us that constant watchfulness is the price of protecting the weak, and that sometimes justice can only come through ways society itself calls wrong. On quiet nights in the Mississippi Delta, when wind moves through the fields where Delaney Plantation once stood, some say you can still hear faint echoes of the past, not real ghosts, but lasting memories of wrongs that were never properly faced or fixed. This is a story that makes us look into the darkest parts of human nature, but also reminds us that even in the worst situations, there is always a chance for resistance, healing, and finally justice, even if it comes from the hands of those society would least expect.